So you have in the idea of Tao the flow of life, the flow of events, the world considered as a stream. And water is very often used by Lao Tzu to give the idea of Tao, because water always takes the line of least resistance. Water is very soft, and yet one of the strongest things in the world. You can chop water with a sword, but leave no wound. You can't squeeze it. You can't compress it. Wonderful stuff. And elsewhere he says, man at his birth is supple and tender, but in death he is rigid and hard. Thus suppleness and tenderness are the marks of life, and rigidity and hardness the marks of death. Tao is always gentle, you see, always yielding. It is feminine, in a way. Lao Tzu says, although you may be a male, always have a certain feminine quality, and thus you will become a universal channel. That has particularly to be learned by men in the United States, who tend to overcompensate masculinity, to be ashamed of gentleness, and to emphasize a kind of attitude to life, which usually indicates a fear of incipient homosexuality. And as a result, we have a lot of misunderstanding between men and women, because each one is so busy being their particular sex that they have nothing in common. So this idea then is the strength of gentleness. And of course it is ultimately on this philosophy that the Japanese worked out the science of judo. Do is the way the Japanese pronounce Dao. Ju means gentle. Judo, the gentle way, whereby a strong man is alarmingly defeated by the use of his own strength against himself. And the analogy is, of course, of the pine tree and the willow tree. The pine tree is a muscle man. And when the snow piles up and becomes icy, the pine tree branch cracks. But when the willow gets snow on it, after a little while the branch drops and the snow falls off and the branch springs up again. That's judo. They teach you in Japan a mysterious science called Aikido. Again, do meaning Tao. Aikido is the inner or esoteric aspect of judo. And they can teach you, for example, to hold out your arm in such a way that no one can bend it, however strong. But it all depends on your not using effort to hold it out. You must not resist. There is a certain way of doing that. So this Tao cannot be defined. That's basic. Just because it is the flow of nature, you can't capture it. You can't shut up wind in a box and expect it to be wind. You can't catch flowing water in a bucket, because the minute it's in the bucket, it's no longer flowing. Now, Tao then means roughly what we would mean by the basic energy of the world. But there are two things to be said about it. And the first is that it is not a governing energy. Here we clearly come up against the principle or a concept of nature in which there is no government. This is an anarchic view of the universe. Not in the sense of chaos, but equally not in the sense of what we mean by order. The Tao does not rule. Lao Tzu says, the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And when merits are accomplished, that is, good things are accomplished, it lays no claim to them. In fact, the Tao is always self-effacing, always disappears, always indefinable, always behind the scenes. And so, in a way, the Lao Tzu's book is written as a manual of advice to rulers. And his idea of a good ruler is one who is never in evidence. Do you know, for example, in Hinsdale, the name of your sanitation chief? I bet you don't. But he's a very, very important official. And Lao Tzu would advise the President of the United States to behave like the chief of sanitation. To be unobtrusive and to generally leave things alone. Let things take their course. Not in the sense of, well, it's like this. It's the difference between rowing and sailing. When you row, it's a relatively stupid method of propulsion because you have to use effort. When you sail, you use the wind. But you don't have to go the way the wind is blowing. You can tack. And tacking so as to go in an opposite direction to the wind is the art of Taoism. Anyone who really understands sailing understands Lao Tzu. So the next thing is that the Tao has a kind of order, but it's not quite what we mean by order. When we speak of order, we usually tend to think of something symmetrical, of something like a library, you know, where all the shelves are rectangular. But the Chinese have a word for order, for the order of the universe, which is this. They pronounce it Li. Now this sign has the original meaning of the markings in jade, or the grain in wood, or the fiber in muscle. So now, when you look at a cloud, or at foam patterns, or at grain patterns in wood, you know for some reason or other that you're not looking at a mess. You're looking at something decidedly wiggly, but aesthetically pleasing. But you can't figure it out. There are no rules which it follows. For in this word has been translated the principle or rationale of nature, almost the law of nature. But the Chinese have no word for the law of nature. They do have a word for law, the word zi, zi. And this word zi, written this way, was originally written like this. And that represented a cauldron, an iron cauldron, with a knife beside it for scratching on the cauldron. Because in very distant times, certain emperors had the laws of the land written on the sacrificial cauldrons to which the people brought offerings, so that when they offered the sacrifices, they could read the laws. But certain sages said you should never do that, because if you write the laws down, people will develop a litigious spirit, and they will always be yakking over what it means. And therefore lawyers will have to define them more carefully. And then other lawyers will drive a carriage with 6 horses right through that. And then other lawyers must again define the laws more carefully. And that's the state we're in today, where we are utterly hamstrung by law. So the Tao is described as being Wu Zi, Wu means is this character, non-legal. The Tao is non-legal in its nature, but it is this, it is Li, and that means orderly in a way that cannot be defined. Just like your own nervous system is certainly orderly, but nobody has been able to figure out the principle of it. But you know at once, without being able to say how, the difference between Li and rigidity and Li and mess, chaos. So what you might call the best way of translating Li into English is to call it organic pattern. That's what it is. But we don't really know what that is because we are it. We are organic pattern. And just as we can't bite our own teeth, we cannot define our own organization. We are it, and that's all we need to be, because the teeth don't need to bite themselves. A saw doesn't need to cut itself. The sun doesn't need to illuminate itself. So then this is the principle of Tao, but it is not law. If it were law, of course, the Tao which could be spoken would be the eternal Tao. But it can't be uttered.